In this section, we'll look at Truman's domestic policies from his re-election in 1948 election through the end of his presidency in 1952. The surprising election of 1948 really emboldened the Democrats and Truman, and they were quite optimistic for their own new invigorated liberal agenda. And Truman unveiled in 1949, indeed, a liberal agenda in his State of the Union address that he called the Fair Deal. And it was an obvious play off Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and even Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal. Undoubtedly, he was trying to build momentum from that connection. Truman's bills came quick. In the next couple of years, you'll see a number of successes of the Fair Deal. The minimum wage, for one, was increased from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour. The Social Security coverage was increased. It expanded appropriations for public power, and reclamation, flood control, and slum clearance. Also, Truman got the National Housing Act of 1949 passed. That authorized the construction of 810,000 new subsidized low-income housing. It sort of foretold Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Also, the Fair Deal included the establishment of the National Science Foundation, which would help advance science. The Fair Deal finally included a displaced persons bill, admitting more than 400,000 new refugees into the United States. Of course, the Republicans remained strong despite losing both houses of Congress in 1948, and they were still able to defeat some of what Truman's Fair Deal proposed. For example, Truman wanted to repeal Taft-Hartley, and he pushed hard in the Fair Deal for that. But he rejected a compromise amendment. He gambled that he could still get votes for a complete repeal, but it proved to be a mistake, and so nothing happened, and the Taft-Hartley bill remained in force, much to the chagrin of labor. Also, Truman pushed again for national health insurance, but the American Medical Association had a massive advertising and spending lobbying campaign against it, and so there was no national health insurance. Also, Truman really didn't get as much aid to education as he liked. The Roman Catholic Church came out against it because Truman didn't include subsidies for parochial schools, the Catholic schools. As Truman fought for the Fair Deal, he also found the Korean War troublesome as well domestically. Truman and his advisors believed that American involvement in the war required economic mobilization at home, kind of like during World War II. No one knew how long the Korean War would last, or if it was just the first salvo in a much longer Cold War. So Truman pressed Congress to pass the Defense Production Act of 1950. He also issued an executive order creating the Office of Defense Mobilization. Now, the legislation and the new bureaucracy worked fairly well. Unemployment remained low and inflation remained in check, albeit despite a sharp one-time uptick in the last half of 1950. The American people, however, had grown tired of the government regulation after all the New Deal and World War II regulations. The new Truman regulations may have been effective, but they remained widely unpopular. As the 1952 election approached, Truman faced yet another setback. The steel industry went on strike, and Truman used his executive authority to seize the steel mines and temporarily run them until an agreement could be reached. The companies whose mines had been seized, they took Truman to court to overturn his actions. And in June 1952, just 5 months before the 1952 elections, the Supreme Court declared the seizures were unconstitutional by a 6-3 vote. Private management and the companies resumed their discussions, and in time the strike ended with the new workers' contract. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court had sent Truman a strong rebuke only months before the election. Republicans also attacked Truman for being corrupt as the 1952 elections approached, charges that had dogged him since his early connections to the political boss Tom Pendergast. A lot of the charges swirled around Truman's longtime military aide, Harry Vaughn. Seeking to end charges of corruption in his party, Arkansas Democrat J. William Fulbright headed a Senate investigation into Vaughn, ultimately finding him guilty of only minor ethical and legal breaches. In the process of that investigation, Republicans began pressing charges of kickbacks and questionable loans by a number of other federal bureaucrats. Few charges involved high-level Truman figures, but the charges hurt nevertheless. The most serious charges for Truman were in the Department of Justice and the IRS. Truman demanded his Attorney General J. Howard McGrath fire the people that are causing the problems, but McGrath bungled the operation, and Truman demanded McGrath's resignation in March 1952. All this bad publicity surrounding it all, of course, promised to hurt the Democrats in the 1952 election. As the 1952 election approached, Truman knew that his chances of remaining in office were probably slim. The Korean War was ongoing and was unpopular, and of course the charges of corruption hurt Truman. His economic regulations weren't particularly popular, and it was a simple reality that Democrats had held office since 1932, 2 decades. And there was the continuing Republican charges that the Democrats were weak on communism. It all added up, and so Truman decided not to seek re-election in 1952. The 22nd Amendment had just been ratified in 1951, limiting the president to 2 terms, but it had explicitly exempted the incumbent Truman. Truman, however, realized that he faced long odds and didn't want to bring down the Democrats, so he quietly began trying to get a good replacement. First, he tried to get Supreme Court Justice Fred Vincent to run, but he declined. And then he tried to get the very popular and famous World War II General Dwight Eisenhower, who had not yet declared his party affiliation, to run. When both of these men rejected Truman's offers, Truman announced that he would not seek re-election and threw his support behind the Illinois governor, Adlai Stevenson. This includes a section on Truman's second term up to the 1952 election.